Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to my YouTube show. Today I'm going to create a new series about the history of the Cold War or Cold War stories, which is basically where I will tell the stories, well, I will tell the lectures about the Cold War, and that's what I'm going to be making this new series. So this is going to be about the lectures of the Cold War, the stories of the Cold War, and I hope you guys enjoy this new series. So anyway, I'm going to start with the first video, which is about the beginning of the Cold War, the end of World War I, and the rise of communism. Okay, so if you remember by 1945, or between 1944 and 1945, that was when the war in World War II, that was when World War II was still going on, basically. And so the allies like Soviet Union, USSR, or present-day Russia, which we call today, and the United States and the other Western powers started pushing back the Nazis from the Europe back into the Germany. And so the Russians started liberating the Eastern Europe, which was basically under Nazi control, and the Germans and the Allies, the United States, started pushing back the Germans from the south, the Western Germany, basically. And so after that, it was by 1945. That was when we started winning the war, and then that was when the Yeltsin Conference was held in the Yalta, Ukraine, present-day Ukraine. But then it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was one of the 15 republics of the USSR, basically. And so after that, during that meeting, it was when Stalin, the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or USSR, met up with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States, and with Winston Churchill, who was the prime minister of the United Kingdom or the Great Britain. And so these three men met up in Yalta and they discussed about the future of post-war Europe. And so Stalin said that the countries that I liberated or the Russians liberated will come under our control, and the countries that you liberated, to Churchill and Roosevelt, will come under the Western rule, which was going to be like the United States and Britain. And so after the war, that was in September of 1945, shortly after we dropped the two atomic bombs on the Japanese, and one was on Hiroshima and then one was on Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. And so the war in Europe was already over. The war in Europe's been over for 3 months since May 1945, and the war ended in September of 1945. So that meant the war lasted for 6 years, from 1939 all the way to 1945. And so after this, a lot of Europe was destroyed, devastated by the Germans following the war, because they took over a lot of countries, and a lot of towns and cities were destroyed during the war. And so the United States launched or created a plan which was called the Marshall Plan, which was to recreate Europe from the destruction that Germany caused during the war, from most of the war, basically. And so a lot of cities were constructed during that period. And so in the Soviet Union, Stalin launched his own plan. He came up with the Molotov plan, which was to recreate the cities in Soviet Union that were destroyed, basically. That lasted from the late 40s all the way to, I think it was from the late 40s to the end of the 40s, I believe. Or maybe the beginning of the 50s, I think. And so after that, that was when I think it was between 1947 or 1948. That was when the Cold War began. So 3 years after World War One ended, 3 to 2 years after World War One ended. And so basically, Churchill gave a speech about the Soviet Union Soviet Union was like an enemy, basically, and it was a communist, basically, and they are evil people, basically. That's what Churchill gave a speech about. And so, but 2 years prior, 2 or 1 years prior to that speech, he visited the United States, and he was warned that the Soviet Union was an ally, was not an ally to the United States. It was a traitor, basically. They were, because they were communist. The Soviet Union was communist, and Churchill didn't believe it, and then he started to believe it later on, by the end of the 40s. And so, because no, the reason why they were no longer allies was basically because the Soviet Union started to establish this dictatorship, and the dictatorship in the Eastern Europe, basically. So that was what they were doing during that time. And so they were no longer allies with the United States. And they became enemies. The United States and Soviet Union became enemies, and that started the conflict, which is known to many of us today as the Cold War, which would last for 40 years, for 4 decades, and the world would be in fear of nuclear war, which I will talk about in my next lecture of the Cold War stories. Okay, so by the end of the 40s, that was when communism started to spread into the Eastern Europe and Asia. And so some countries in Asia, like China and North Korea, fell under communism, and a bunch of other Asian countries like Vietnam and a bunch of others. And then the communist forces in 1949 took control of the China, and then Mao Zedong became the new leader of the China, and then he was made new leader of China. He was the dictator of the Red China for a long time, from 1949 all the way to his death until 1976, from what I recall correctly, until he died. And so, but before he took power, there was a fight going on in China, a struggle for power between the nationalists and communists, who was going to take power. But then during World War II, they were allies. They were fighting against the Japanese forces who were in the Asia or in the Pacific War, basically. That was when the United States were fighting against the Japanese forces. And so on October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong took power of China, and the nationalist government of China fled to Taiwan, which still remains there today. The nationalist government of China is in Taiwan today, to this day still. It's still there. And then later on, it was the nationalist forces were led by Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist. He was against communism, and that he thought against Mao. But then in North Korea, North Korea was liberated by the Soviet Union in the World War II, by the end of World War II, from the Japanese occupation. Because if you remember, North Korea, which was known as the Korean Peninsula, was basically under a Japanese rule, and it remained there from 1910s all the way to 1945. That was when the United States and the Soviet Union kicked the Japanese's butts out of Korea, basically. And so because like the Japanese had control of Korea. They were in control of the media. They were in control of newspapers and stuff, basically stuff like that. And they had control of it. And so after that, after the Japanese were kicked out of Japan, out of North Korea, because the United States dropped the 2 bombs on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so after that, the North was occupied by the Soviet Union, and the South was occupied by the United States, basically. And so after that, it was a communist dictatorship was established in the East, in the north, led by Kim Il-sung, and then the south was established by Syngman Rhee, who was the president, who would become the president of South Korea during that time. And so these two nations would go to war against each other. That was when North Korea invaded South Korea, and so they were at war for over 3 years during this time. And so the South was supported by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and a bunch of other Western countries like West Germany. And the North was supported by the Soviet Union, or which we call Russia now, and by the East Germany and other bunch of communist countries supported the North Korea, basically. And so a war was fought there for over 3 years. And by November of 1950, American troops were pushing deep into North Korea. Basically, they were advancing deeper into North Korea. And so after that, the war was still going on for 3 years. And so during that time, I think it was U.S. General, the famous U.S. General in World War II, Douglas MacArthur, took part in the Korean War, and he basically wanted to prevent communism from going into the South, basically. And so he planned to drop an atomic bomb on the North Korea, basically, to prevent it from preventing communism from coming into the South. That was his plan. He wanted to drop an atomic bomb on the North Korea. But then that didn't happen because he was fired by U.S. President Harry Truman in the April of 1951. So he couldn't do that. And Harry Truman was like, "You gone way too far," basically. And so the war would continue on for about 3 years, and then it would end in 1953, June 1953. That ended when the Korea became South and North Korea, and that the Koreas were divided, kind of like the present day, kind of like the East and West Germany was with the Berlin Wall, built in 1961. And North Korea and South Korea still remain divided to this very day still. And North Korea is communist, and then South Korea is capitalist, basically, which still remains there today. It still remains there today. Then at the time, it was when the war began. The North Korea invaded the South Korea at the 38th parallel, which is where North Korea is divided. North and South Korea are divided, basically. And so during that time, and then but 2 months prior, before the invasion of the South Korea took place in June of 1950. That was basically when Stalin gave the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung the permission to invade South Korea, which would trigger the Korean War. And so even to this day, still there are still some strict laws in North Korea, kind of like the Soviet Union was. So it said if you worship religion in North Korea, you would be arrested, and you would not go to church, basically, kind of like the law in Soviet Union was. And you can't do whatever you want. You can't read books about religion, basically, kind of like in Soviet Union was during that time. So those were some of the laws in the North Korea, and it was kind of strict, like in the Soviet Union, because they had similar laws, because they were both communist countries. You know how communist countries are nowadays. So Okay, so in my next video or in my next lecture, I am going to talk about the Berlin airlift, the use of nuclear weapons, and the rise of Nikita Khrushchev. And I'll see you guys in my next Cold War stories or lectures on the Cold War. Okay, I'll see you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture, and I'll talk about those three topics in my next lecture. Thank you very much for watching.